I am Paola de la Calle. I'm an interdisciplinary artist, and my work deals with notions of home, identity, borders, and nostalgia. Particularly in this project, I'm really influenced by having grown up in a mixed status family and witnessing the effects of having my caretakers being undocumented and my sister being a migrant child herself, who was undocumented for the majority of her life. So for me, this project really made me pull on a lot of personal experiences in order to inform the way that I approached the work and the way that I approach storytelling here, which is why I wanted to make sure to include different migrant voices, different voices from Central America, because my family's from Colombia, and while the United States has had many policies and impacts on Colombia, I know that those are very different from Central America, and I wanted to make sure that those voices were present as well. When I was first thinking of creating a public art intervention or a public art piece, at the scale that we ended up creating the quilt at, my first inspiration was Doris Salcedo, who's a Colombian artist. She makes sculptures, and the reason I turned to her is because her work often focuses on really traumatic or violent events, and she does it from the perspective of the person who has been victimized or the family who is related to the victim, without re-traumatizing the victims or without showing their faces. And I think for me that was something that was really important, because we are faced with images of the children being tear gassed at the border. We're being faced with images of children crying and being ripped from their mother's arms. And I don't think that that's what we need to bring awareness or to bring change. And I think what I really wanted to do was make sure that we were able to include the voices of the children without reliving their trauma. So the quilts, I actively chose to make them really colorful, to think about healing and joy, versus having images of children behind cages or wrapped in the mylar blankets. And ultimately, that is where the idea of the quilt came from, was we're seeing children wrapped in what looks like tinfoil, which is not warm, it's not comforting. And what would it look like if we were greeting these migrant children with quilts instead? If we were greeting them with warm blankets, if we were greeting them with colorful smiles. In the quilts themselves, you'll see a lot of color, but you'll also see images of the children who are part of the migrant caravans, but their faces are the sky and our clouds, because it's a symbol of freedom and of an expansive sky and of being able to imagine and dream big. So you'll see in the quilts as well, for me it was important to, as not being a migrant child myself and not having have their lived experiences, I included some drawings that the children made while they were in the detention centers to kind of have them be the narrators of their own story. For me, working at this scale was something I hadn't ever done before. So it was really about every step of the way, making sure that I was thinking about scale as a constant question in mind. What does it look like for this worry doll to be 2 feet large? What does that say to the viewer? How can the person who is approaching these quilts read it from 100 feet away? How will it be read up close? And ultimately, I think the scale became symbolic of the number of missing children back in November 2020, where there were over 600 children that were missing and we couldn't find them. We didn't know where they were located. We didn't know where their families were located. And altogether, the quilts are over 600 square feet, which represent the number of missing children. It was a constant reminder of how vast this issue is and how many children are currently being traumatized and are being caged and are being separated from their families. So the size itself became a symbol in the work, not just because we were going to be marching with them, but because it represents the children too. a narrative that is also not really being told is that there's a lot of teenagers as well. And I think we're often presented images of children, young children, because they feel that this is how folks can connect to these stories. But in reality, teenagers are still children as well, and I wanted to make sure that I brought that story into the quilts. And one of the images that is really sticking out to me right now is the piscuchas. So in El Salvador, they do this festival of piscuchas where the children make their own kites and they fly them. And for me, I thought it was beautiful, beautiful and symbolic of freedom and of being able to just imagine yourself soaring in the sky. And I think because the sky is the background of all of the quilts, the sky itself became a symbol for freedom and for liberation. And I can't forget all of the imagery that came from the poets whose words are included in all of the quilts, and they kind of act as a way for us to stitch together different voices from Central America that all talk about like healing and resistance and joy and home, and their words really informed the artwork itself. So at one point there's a poet who writes about giving olive branches, and we included olive branches in the artwork as a symbol of peace. And they talk about super strings tying up the universe. So the piscuchas, the strings themselves are made up of the words and the poetry from that specific poet. Every poet had some sort of influence on the imagery that we ended up using, or that I ended up choosing to include in all of the collages that make up the quilt too. So I think this project for me was really inspired by the AIDS memorial quilts that were unveiled in 1987, particularly that project because it was a very silent. If you see footage from that day, you see that there was a lot of silence because there was a lot of honoring, there was a lot of remembering, there was an emphasis on really taking your time with the work. And I think I have no idea what the 100th day in DC is going to bring, but what I do hope happens is that people have an opportunity to sit with the quilts and look at each one and try to pull the stories, try to pull their own moments of reflection with each quilt. I know that we're gonna have volunteers that are supporting us holding each quilt, and I think the weight of the quilt themselves also says a lot about the weight of what we carry as a country when we do not count the missing children, when we do not know their names, when we do not know where they are, when we separate kids from their families. I think it adds a layer of introspection, and I hope that folks are able to reflect. And yeah, just take their time with it because it was a long, slow process. What's really important about our campaign is that it doesn't just talk about freeing the kids. It doesn't just talk about reuniting the families. It goes into the healing portion of it. So for me, it was really important to, if we're thinking about healing, which is something few people are having conversations about because we're not even at the uncaging yet. For me, it was important to envision and create that vision for folks as well about what is the future like when kids are free? What is the future like when you heal? So as we were looking for poets, that was a really important piece of it, that it was joyful resistance and healing. Folks who had visions of home that did not focus on trauma. So often immigrants are only cast under the light of trauma, only cast under the light of their border crossing, only cast under the light of their status. And that's not right. There's so many other dimensions to being an immigrant in this country or being in community with immigrants in this country. It was important for me to put trust in folks, you know, like these are not my quilts, these are our quilts. And I think that that's just when I think about like all the folks who contributed to it, that's why I say it wasn't my vision. It was all of us, and that's why it was important for me to also like lean into the trust of the folks who were here and supporting. It shows you like the value and the power of community, the power of unity when folks from all over the country come together for something that we know is just not right. So we put a call out to poets and we got a beautiful, beautiful response. It was so hard to choose. But we really wanted to focus on healing, on resistance, and on joy, right? In visions for the future. So we have 10 different poets and musicians who lent their words and their lyrics to each quilt, who trusted me to pick them apart and put them where I saw fit to create the narrative of uncaging, reunification, and healing. We had seamstresses from across the Bay Area lend their time, lend their machines, lend their threads to stitch together all of the quilts. Everyone on the campaign has been working so hard on all of the different elements of it. So it was essential in order to get these quilts here, in order to get us here, that we have community support and we have community backing.